In the heart of the grand kingdom of Nkutum, where the sun always shone like molten gold upon the earth, only virgins, either young maidens or men, prepared the king's meals. It was believed that only virgins had the pure hands to serve the king's meals. Also in this great kingdom lived a man named Kwaki. His cooking was nothing short of a miracle. The flavor of his dishes was said to call the heavens themselves to descend to earth, and the gods, mighty beings with appetites as eternal as the mountains, would pause their celestial duties just to taste his food. Word of Kwaki's talent spread like wildfire, crossing mountains and rivers, until it reached the ears of the king. The king, wise and discerning, knew that a kingdom's prosperity is shaped by the belly of its ruler. So, he called upon Kwaki, the cook of legend, to be head of the royal kitchen and essentially, the royal taster, one who would taste every meal prepared for the king before it was placed on the royal table. This was not just a matter of flavor, but of safety, for poison had been the shadow that had hovered over kings since the dawn of time. Kwaki, humble yet proud of his craft, accepted the king's request, and his reputation grew even greater. No dish could pass the royal lips without first crossing his discerning taste. But behind Kwaki's skillful hands and unwavering loyalty, there lay a secret, a dark, whispered sin, like a single cloud in a clear sky. Kwaki, though devoted to his art, was not immune to the temptations of the flesh. His charm was as boundless as his culinary talent, and he found himself sneaking into the beds of the wives of powerful men, leaving broken hearts and shattered vows in his wake. This sin did not go unnoticed, a great taboo at that, especially for someone who went in and out of the royal palace. And the gods, ever watchful of such betrayals, had had enough. One fateful night, after Kwaki had stolen the heart of a chieftain's wife, the gods, in their divine justice, cursed him. The curse was as strange as it was cruel. From that moment on, whenever Kwaki tasted a dish made with pepper, a spice as common as the air he breathed, his body would rebel in agony. His skin would rise in fiery welts, his throat would tighten, and his breath would become ragged. But by the following dawn, as if the night had never happened, Kwaki would awaken unscathed, his body healed, as though the gods had momentarily forgiven him. So it was that Kwaki, the loyal royal taster, endured this terrible affliction in silence. No one knew of his curse, for each morning he rose, unmarked by the trials of the night before, and returned to his duties as though nothing had happened. His loyalty to the king, as steadfast as the mountains, remained unbroken. But one day, during a grand banquet in the palace, disaster struck. The cooks, in their eagerness to impress, had prepared a dish of rich, spicy pepper soup, its aroma rising like smoke from the fires of the earth. Kwaki, as always, took the first bite, and immediately the curse took hold. His body shook, his throat closed, and he collapsed in a heap, gasping for air. His face, once full of life, now looked like a bloated fruit on the vine, swollen and reddened. The courtiers, those who served the king and watched the royal feast with eyes that missed no detail, were thrown into a frenzy. "Has the royal taster been poisoned?" one whispered, the words flying like sparks in dry grass. The king, as swift as the wind, was at Kwaki's side in an instant, his face contorted with worry. "What is this madness? Kwaki, speak," he cried, but the royal taster could only cough and choke, unable to explain what was happening. The courtiers, their hearts gripped by fear, began to murmur amongst themselves. Could someone in the kitchen be trying to poison the king? One questioned, the thought as bitter as sour milk. The king, though trusting Kwaki more than any man in the kingdom, could not ignore the alarming scene before him. His eyes darted to the cooks, who stood in the corners, their faces pale with fear. The courtiers, in their confusion and panic, began to point fingers at the cooks. "Who among you has betrayed the king?" one of them shouted. "Who has poisoned the royal taster?" The king, though his heart still held faith in Kwaki, could not ignore the growing suspicion. The courtiers, trembling with the weight of the moment, assumed that the cooks had attempted to poison the royal table. The fear that clouded their minds was like a heavy fog, and in their panic, they turned on the cooks. The royal kitchens, once a place of bustling joy and creativity, became a hall of judgment. New cooks were hired, old cooks were dismissed, and those who failed to live up to the royal expectations were swiftly banished. Some, in their desperation to protect the king, even lost their lives, executed as traitors. But no matter how many cooks came and went, the same thing happened. Each time Kwaki tasted a dish with pepper, he suffered the same terrible reaction. The kingdom's once thriving pool of virgins, who alone were allowed to prepare the king's food, dwindled, and soon there were no young women left in the kingdom. Only the married women remained, and yet it was believed that only virgins had the pure hands to serve the king's meals. The kingdom, once filled with life, now languished in despair, unable to provide the king with food fit for a ruler. The king sent messengers to neighboring kingdoms, begging them to send virgins to fill the royal kitchens. The neighboring kingdoms, seeing the plight of Nkutum, agreed, but the same problem persisted. The foreign virgins, though they came in good faith, could not escape the curse that plagued the royal kitchen. They too were accused of treachery, but since they were guests in the kingdom, they could not be executed. And so, the kingdom was left with no cooks, no virgins, and no way to satisfy the king's hunger. The courtiers, now more fearful than ever, wondered if they had cursed their own land, and the people began to whisper of the gods' displeasure. It was at this moment of despair that the king, burdened by guilt and grief, turned to the divine healer, a wise woman known for her ability to see beyond the veil of mortal eyes. The healer listened to the king's story and pondered the mystery that had plagued the kingdom for so long. After a long period of silence, she spoke, her voice as calm as the evening breeze. "The curse that has fallen upon your kingdom," she said, "was not cast by any mortal hand. It is a punishment from the gods themselves. The royal taster, Kwaki, is guilty, but not of treachery. His body suffers the consequences of his own sins, sins that have been visited upon him by the gods for the betrayal of sacred vows." The king, stunned by the revelation, sank to his knees. "Then it is I who have been blind," he whispered, regret heavy in his voice. "I put blind trust in Kwaki, and that had led to the shedding of many innocent blood." The healer nodded. "The curse was placed upon him, not to destroy the kingdom, but to teach him a lesson in humility. The gods are just, and they have revealed the truth at last." The king, with a heart weighed down by guilt, summoned Kwaki to the palace. When Kwaki arrived, his head bowed in shame, the king addressed him with sorrowful eyes. "Kwaki, you betrayed my trust," the king said, his voice roaring like thunder in a storm. "I protected you, sentenced innocent men and women to death, and cast out many cooks, all because of you. Not knowing you were responsible for all that has happened." Kwaki, remorseful, knelt before him. "Your Majesty, I did not mean for any of this to happen. Please forgive me." The king, in his grief and remorse, decreed that Kwaki should be exiled, for the gods had shown that the punishment for his sin was to live away from the kingdom he had loved. And so, Kwaki was banished to the outskirts of the kingdom, then later executed. And as for the king, his own fate was sealed. The gods, seeing his failure to act with wisdom and patience, visited their own punishment upon him. From that day forward, no food in his kingdom could satisfy him. Every dish tasted bitter, as if the gods themselves had denied him the joy of his kingdom's once proud feasts. Thus, the kingdom of Nkutum learned a bitter lesson, that fear, suspicion, and haste in judgment can destroy a kingdom. And that true wisdom lies in seeking the truth before it is too late.